Thank you very much, dear Raida. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear colleagues, as you have heard and as you probably might have assumed, I am not Gregor Schoeler, but unfortunately he is not able to be with us today due to his illness, but I will be more than happy to lend my voice to his words. So I suggest that we start. Moritz is accompanying me with the PowerPoint presentation and helping me out. Okay. The early Islamic teaching and transmission system, a manifold challenge. Slide 3. When the Prophet Muhammad passed away, there was not yet an edited book called Al-Quran al-Karim. All that was available were scattered writings on disparate materials, pieces of papyrus or leather, palm stalks, camel bones, leaves, etc. Muslim tradition is in agreement in this regard. The first scholarly effort in Islam was to compile, organize, and edit these materials and shape them into a proper book. The person who met this substantial challenge was Zayd ibn Thabit, who died around 670. Do you hear me? Oh, okay. Commissioned by Caliph Omar, who reigned between 634 to 644, he transcribed the scattered texts on sheets of equal size. 20 years later, Zayd, on an order of the third Caliph, Uthman, carried out an official edition of the Quran text. An equally great intellectual challenge arose in the last third of the 7th century to confront a youthful Islam. In Medina, the city of the Prophet, far away from the new political center in Damascus, emerged in the first generation of people who had not experienced Muhammad in person, the Tabi'un, interest in the words and deeds of the Prophet. Sons and grandsons of the oldest believers were the ones who, prevented by fate to take part in the contemporary political life, turned to the study of a glorious past. They gathered information from the Prophet's companions, Sahaba, who were still alive. The reports were called Hadith, piece of news, narration, account. And one of the most important of these collectors or researchers was Urwa ibn al-Zubayr, who lived from 643-4 to 712-13. The son of a cousin of the Prophet, al-Zubayr ibn al-Awam, and brother of the counter-caliph, Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr. He conducted a systematic collection of legal, exegetical, and historical traditions, in particular those concerning the life of the Prophet. His most valuable source of information was the Prophet's widow, Aisha, who was one of his mother's sisters. She provided answers for his questions and gave him reports, sometimes in great detail, on the most important events, such as on the Hijrah that she took part in as a little girl. These reports are recorded as hadith in the collections of traditions and historical works. Urwa put down the reports of his informants in writing. This is expressly attested with regard to the answers given by Aisha to him. A principle for organizing the collected material needed to be developed. For the legal traditions, Urwa followed the practice of ordering according to thematic areas. Hence, he presented in his teaching first the hadith relevant to marriage and divorce, then those pertaining to the pilgrimage, etc. This organizing principle introduced by Urwa is the precursor of tasnif, that is, the method of arranging the chapters of a work systematically according to subject matter. It became common practice in the 8th and 9th centuries. Examples are Malik ibn Anas, Al-Muwatta and the canonical hadith works. Urwa, who were teaching publicly in Damascus in the mosque, also lectured in his family circle. The mosque throughout the entire pre-modern period, also when in the 11th century the madrasas arose, never ceased to be a preeminent venue for mediating higher education. Yes, slide 8. In later times, teaching took place also in libraries, schools, and other public and private buildings. Lecture, teaching, and transmission as a unit. This model would become the template for the coming period. One problem that already at this early date absolutely needed to be solved was that of authenticating the reports. With regard to both legal hadith and historical traditions recounting the deeds of the Prophet, it seemed necessary to name the original informant and the transmitters of the statement or report. In the case of Urwa, this development is first engaged in its initial stages. He and his contemporaries do not yet provide witnesses on a consistent basis. In the instances where Urwa does do so, his most frequent informant is his aunt, Aisha. This marks the beginning of the isnads, chains of transmitters. Whereas Urwa generally names only one person as source in his indications of origin, namely Aisha, the students who heard and passed the hadith on from him name first their teacher, Urwa, and then the person from whom Urwa himself heard the hadith, for instance, Urwa from Aisha. This is how in time chains of transmitters come into being, to which each new generation adds a new link. In later works, the isnad must introduce each and every hadith. In the case of this authorization system, the possibility of Jewish influence is not to be dismissed. In the Jewish schools, where Mishnah was taught and transmitted orally, lectures were expected to name, whenever possible, the early authorities who had pronounced the legal rulings. The transmission chains should extend as far back as possible. In Urwa's time, there may already have been enough Jewish converts who were familiar with the authorization system and capable of introducing it into Islamic transmission practices. It must be emphasized that this type of knowledge transfer was not limited to religious and historical sciences. It found application likewise in the linguistic, philological, and other disciplines, such as in Arabic grammar. In the field of grammar, for instance, Sibawahi's Al-Kitab, the book per se, is an example. It was called the Quran of grammar because it was foundational to this science and the most important book in it, and because, like the Quran, it was subject to an ongoing process of commenting. Slide 9. The scholars under the influence of the court, or the court impulse. Urwa had prepared Kutub Fiqh, notebooks containing legal hadith and legal opinions, as a memory aid. However, they are said to have been burned on the Yawm al-Qara 683 during the Medinian uprising against the Umayyads. That some of his written documents have nonetheless come down to us is thanks to a commission of the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik, who reigned from 685 to 705. In letters to Urwa, who in the meantime was considered a notable religious authority as one of the 7 Medinian jurists, he posed questions about legal problems, but mainly about events from the life of the Prophet. Urwa answered them in letters that took the form of small reports or treatises. They were transmitted as normal hadith by his son Hisham in lectures, which is why they survived. These letters are of priceless historical value. They are among the earliest primary scholarly documents written in Islam. The letter from later became the model for the scholarly treatise genre. In the following period, the court consistently worked towards having scholars send them written material. The effect of this impulse was that scholars who had heretofore only transmitted their material orally to their students broke a taboo and had to publish their records in writing. Slide 12. The most important and most sustainable commission was the one given around the middle of the 2nd or 8th century by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, who reigned between 1754 and 1775, to one of the grand disciples of Urwa, Ibn Ishaq. The Caliph wanted to have from Ibn Ishaq a book on the biography of the Prophet. Accordingly, Ibn Ishaq composed it. It was entitled Kitab al-Maghazi, Book of the Campaigns. This work was something completely new. It contains not only the compiled traditions on the life of the Prophet, more than that, the Hadith are accompanied by accounts of Muhammad's orations, contracts, and other documents, stories of the old prophets, etc. Copies of the work prepared by Ibn Ishaq for the court are no longer extant. That we are nonetheless able to generate somewhat of an exact portrayal of the original is because Ibn Ishaq passed the content of his work on to numerous students who wrote down the material or received it through dictation and transmitted it further. And this is when Ibn Ishaq's materials found their way into compilations like At-Tabari's Tarikh. 2 generations after Ibn Ishaq, one of his grand disciples, Ibn Hisham, compiled and edited the material harking back to Ibn Ishaq in a proper book, the Kitab Sira Rasulallah, the book on the life of the Messenger of God. It is extant in many manuscripts and represents the most important source on the life of Muhammad. The character of Ibn Ishaq's original, its coherent and connected narrative in particular, is maintained in Ibn Hisham's edition. Next slide. And then, yes. Over time, a variety of teaching methods developed. When the teacher or sheikh lectured and the students listened, it is called sama, auditing, hearing, or lecture. A special variant of the sama was a dictation, imla. At certain times, dictation was considered to be the best method of teaching. Entire books were dictated to huge audiences. Next slide. When a student was given the task of reciting the text, it was called qira'ah, reading, or art, presentation. The teacher, assuming a supervisory role, then controlled the correctness of the presentation. Next slide. Other, less precise methods of transmission, for example, simple copying of notebooks, kitaba or wijada, did exist, but never received full recognition. The heard or audited transmission, a riwaya al-masmu', was always considered the most reliable because a learned and authorized master, the teacher, was present, and because only through hearing, auditing, was it guaranteed that the words were correctly read and understood. This is grounded, inter alia, in the recognition that not only the vowel signs, but also the diacritical marks were frequently not placed when writing quickly. Hadith, philology, and medical education abound in anecdotes describing the fatal consequences mere copying can have. The isnad of a hadith qudsi, that is, a hadith that is traced back via the Prophet to God, is reported to have been misread by a hadith student in a memorable way. The isnad is, slide 17, حدثاني فلان قال أخبراني فلان عن فلان عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم عن الله عز وجل. So and so related to me, saying, so and so related to me from the Prophet, God bless him and grant him salvation from God Almighty. Next slide. The student is reported to have read it as follows. أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم عن الله عن رجل. From the Prophet, God bless him and grant him salvation, from God, from a man. Which naturally elicited great dismay, but also laughter. Different times back then. I'm not sure how many would laugh today. That was my side remark. The Christian physician Said ibn al-Hassan from the 11th century reports in a medical work how in some cases erroneous dotting in the names of medicines had lethal consequences. In later Islamic teaching practices, the aforesaid basic forms were maintained but also yielded variants and were accompanied by completely new methods of teaching and learning. From around the 10th, 11th century on, teaching activities witnessed an interesting upgrade of the audience. Found in numerous writings that were clearly used for instructions are so-called audience certificates, the so-called tabata sama. New slide, thanks. Okay, this is what it looks like. These are notes in which the names of the participants at the lecture are systematically listed. From the 12th century on, in Iraq and Syria, especially in the fields of hadith, law, and edifying tales, public educational lectures, likewise called sama, were held. They were conducted by a shaykh, or more rarely by a shaykha, who had personally heard the text from an authorized master. These samas were attended not only by experts and students, but by great masses of people as well, men, women, and even children and slaves. The names of everyone present were included in the audition certificate in the shaykh's transcript. All participants were then entitled to teach and pass on what they heard. In the event that they had not taken notes at the lecture, but later wanted to make use of their teaching license, they could afterwards prepare a written draft of the lecture or procure it elsewhere and fulfill a teaching commission on its basis. This was necessary when the lectures had been heard in childhood. Likewise, in the madrasas, the high schools that also arose in the 11th century, the lecture presented by the professor, or mudarris, continued to be an important form of teaching. Teaching in this regard mostly took place with the professor or his assistant, mu'id, presenting section by section a generally recognized foundational or standard work in the fields of law, rhetoric, or logic, and so on. The professor then provided commentary on each section. The students would write the commentary down. Commentaries published by students could become new works that were themselves commentated by means of super commentaries, clauses, etc. A substantial part of the literature that emerged from the activities in the madrasas are manuscripts comprising complexes of foundational texts, commentary, and super commentary. Next slide. The challenge the system poses to Western scholarship. Yes. Understanding the early Islamic teaching system was a big challenge also to Western science, to whose attention it had come as of around the middle of the 19th century. More than just interest in the detailed structure of the system, two problems stood at the forefront from the very start. The question of the written or oral mode of the teaching activities and the question of the authenticity or source value of the transmission, hadith in particular. The lettermost question proved especially urgent because the early texts, apart from the Quran, were not conclusively redacted into the form we have before us today until 150 to 200 years after the events they describe. Ibn Hisham's biography of the Prophet, Kitab al-Sirah, wasn't written until some 200 years after the Prophet's death. Next slide. As for the first question, the one concerning the written or oral mode of transmission, it is strange that standing all the way in the beginning of research was an important, fundamentally correct insight that little by little was lost and not rediscovered and developed until the 80s of the previous century. Alois Sprenger, who lived from 1813 to 1893, remarked in his book on the Prophet Muhammad, quote, "We must distinguish between private notes as a memory aid, lecture notebooks, and published books with fixed texts." End of the quote. Ignaz Goldziher lived 1850 to 1921, took over Sprenger's insight in this regard. He was also aware of most of the teaching forms. With respect to the question of authenticity, his recognition was highly significant, namely that numerous hadith could not be original and genuine because tendencies and theological ideas of a later period can be discerned in them. This correct understanding, however, had the fatal consequence that later Islamicists came to the conclusion that a large portion, if not the entire early Islamic tradition, was a forgery. That is not what Goldziher had said. Next slide. Josef Schacht. A blanket forgery of hadith does, however, describe the assessment proffered by Josef Schacht, who lived from 1902 to 1969, in his highly influential book, The Origins of Mohammedan Jurisprudence, which was published in 1950. Schacht asserted that the entire early Islamic tradition, not only the legal hadith, but the historical as well, had not arisen before the mid-2nd or 8th century. The isnads are fake. The names of the transmitters in the isnads are for the most part simply selected at random. The biographies of the Prophet, including Ibn Ishaq's, owing to their very recent origin in the 2nd or 8th century, are of no historical value. Apart from some minor opposition, Schacht's theory was initially adapted by Western Islamicists almost without challenge and prevailed up to the end of the 1960s. A turnaround came in particular with the publication of the first volume of Fuad Setzkin's monumental Geschichte des arabischen Schrifttums, History of Arabic Literature, which was published in 1967. And Fuad Setzkin, our Frankfurt colleague, lived from 1924 to 2018. Setzkin, at that time a professor at the Frankfurt University, was the first to outline the early Islamic transmission system comprehensively and in detail. According to Setzkin, there had been a continuous process of collecting and recording the traditions in writing, a process that already began during the life of the Prophet and peaked with the production of ordered compilations, tasnif, since the 8th century. Setzkin was able to bring forth copious evidence of the fact that the scholars were using kutub, books. This is why he understood the early Islamic system as a process which essentially involved the transmission of written documents and books. And because the process was controlled by the authors and authorized transmitters, he was able to conclude a prevailing authenticity of this tradition. Contra Setzkin's theories, his Frankfurt colleague Rudolf Sellheim, lived from 1928 to 2013, stepped to the fore. His own studies, mainly, however, the dissertations of many of his students, pursue the question of how the sources of the large compilations, for example, Tabari's Tarikh or Ibn Hisham's Kitab al-Sirah, etc., are composed. Are the sources written works, books, as Setzkin asserts, or oral transmissions? One of Sellheim's students, Sadun al-Samuk, was able to show in his dissertation in 1978 that the reconstruction of Ibn Ishaq's original Kitab al-Maghazi, which exists only in transmissions from students, grad students, and in reworkings, would lead to a confusing inconsistency owing to the many variations in the transmitted texts. That led al-Samuk to conclude that transmission of the Prophet biographical traditions up to Ibn Hisham and at-Tabari were not achieved by copying from books, but in some form or another through oral transmission. Next slide. Yeah, Patricia Kron. And the discussion concerning the written or oral mode of the early Islamic tradition had until then played out mainly in the German language area. before it could spread to the international level, it was overlapped by a discussion in which the question of the authenticity of this tradition was at the forefront. This began after the publication in England of the book by Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, Hagerism, that was published in 1977. Crone-Cook hooked up with the view espoused also in English language areas since the appearance of Schacht's book, that the early Islamic transmission system had all but no historical worth, and sought to underpin this view with new arguments. What was new was that Crone-Cook drew upon non-Muslim sources on the emergence of Islam, sources that arose demonstrably earlier than the Muslim sources, that is, shortly after the death of the Prophet, and allegedly sharply contradict them. The non-Muslim sources were declared by Crone-Cook of greater source value and more reliable than the indigenous sources because of their earlier emergence. This has been the prevailing view in Western English language research up to the present. Meanwhile, in the German language area, discussions concerning the written or the oral mode of the teaching system continued, whereby here the matter of authenticity was very soon included. Works that contributed to the definitive solution of the problem were those primarily concerned with reconstructing the sources of the large historical and literary compilations. The most significant of these works were undertaken at the universities of Halle an der Saale, Gießen, and Frankfurt on the Main. Among the scholars associated with these works are Manfred Fleischhammer, Sebastian Günther, Ursula Setzkin, Georg Staudt, Stefan Leder, and Walter Werkmeister. As to my own research, my first concern was to account for the character and manifestations of the early Islamic transmission system as demonstrated in this lecture. Now, since the oral or written question had activated a series of serious studies, like those of Setzkin on the one hand and the Zellheim school on the other, each of them yielding different and to some extent quite contradictory results, the challenge presenting itself to me was to find a solution to the grand puzzle. One approach I saw as a way to the solution was to resurrect and develop Sprenger's discovery concerning the meaning of the word kitab, that is, anything written. Bless you. Written notes used from the beginning for a long time, however, there were no edited books for a reading public, but only lecture notebooks and texts for teaching. Another insight was that the most prestigious transmission from the Riwaya al-Masmua means heard, audited, not oral transmission. The student should have heard the text under an authorized teacher. Whether or not the text was read or recited from memory is not expressed therein and was also not decisive. The early Islamic transmission method we are dealing with is therefore neither purely oral nor purely written. Rather, it is a living teaching system in which both written and oral aspects were instrumental. It cannot, however, be overlooked that with this transmission method, variations, additions, deletions, etc. in the text can arise. A shaykh may have presented his material differently in different lectures. Students would have produced different written records. Students and the students, in turn, transmitted the material differently. Alterations and errors could arise for a number of reasons, primarily also because the ideal method was in no way always implemented. Nevertheless, while not promoting a verbatim transfer, this method did in fact favor a transmission that was, on the whole, correct in sense. That particular traditions were forged is obvious. Even the indigenous traditionists were aware of that. They even developed a science of its own, al-jarh wa ta'dil, to detect forgeries. The notion that the entire tradition is a blanket forgery, however, is hardly conceivable. Next slide. Just a second. This brings us back to the question of authenticity, the second, even greater challenge that emerged. At the vanguard of those contributing to the solution was the sadly much too early departed Harald Motzki, who died in 2019, with his numerous studies in this regard. I need only call attention here to his book, The Origins of Islamic Jurisprudence, first edition 1991, and the second edition was published in 2002. A counterdraft to Schacht's book, in which, mainly on the basis of an important recently discovered multi-volume work, Abdulrazak's Musannaf, he refutes Schacht's hypothesis of a blanket forgery of Hadith. Next slide, please. As regards my own research, my concern was to check the conclusion inferred by the distinctiveness of the teaching system, that early Islamic tradition is on the whole likely authentic. With this in view, I, in a project sponsored by the Swiss National Fund, had the corpus of reports on the life of the Prophet according to Urwa ibn Zubayr collected and examined. My most valuable co-worker and co-author was Andreas Görke. A great quantity of hadith and historical works were systematically reviewed. The historicity of a large part of Urwa's traditions could be substantiated, thank you, through their having been transmitted further, independent of one another, by two or more of Urwa's students. This is a criterion of multiple attestation in independent sources suggested by exegetical research. If one places, for example, the version of a specific report from Urwa that was transmitted further by his main student, Az-Zuhri, next to the version transmitted further by Urwa's son Hisham, it is generally evident that the sense of both reports is the same, although the wording is different, and that sometimes here, other times there, major or minor additions to and omissions from the text are found. These reports from Urwa were compiled 30 to 60 years after the death of the Prophet. Furthermore, since they originate in part from eyewitnesses to the events, and in every instance from people who were in close contact with Muhammad, they are likely to have portrayed the basic structure of the relevant historical events by and large correctly. Thus, they are hardly younger than the non-Muslim reports. I might also add that my most recent findings show that these non-Muslim reports hardly contradict the oldest Muslim reports, and at times are remarkably found to even supplement them. In closing, I would like to express my firm conviction that it is fundamentally possible to reconstruct the emergence of Islam by developing and applying suitable reconstructive methods. Towards this end, I have demonstrated in my inquiry one way. I am certain that other approaches are on hand in other areas. With this in mind, I would like to wish my colleague, Professor Özsoy, and his team the best of success in their fascinating project, Reconstructing the Dynamics of the Emergence of Islam, Possibilities and Limitations. So that was the paper. By Gregor Schoeler. I have a few more words, also according to his wish to be read. Dear Ömer Özsoy, Professor Schoeler has requested that I extend his gracious thanks to you for inviting him to this keynote lecture. He sees this invitation as a great honor and appreciation of his research. And you, dear ladies and gentlemen, he would like to thank for your attendance in such numbers and for the great interest you have shown in the lecture. And he also would like to thank me for assuming the task in his place of reading the lecture, the lecture text and carrying out the presentation. As I said, it was a great honor and it was a great pleasure. And thank you very much for listening.